So again, good afternoon. My name is Monica Ohura Muraguri, and I'll be the moderator for today's ByteLex Friday event. ByteLex has webinars every Friday, and this is our second episode for, well, actually our first episode for this month. And today's discussion is basically around startup policies and how these particular policies are seen to affect startups. So today we are here simply to pick the minds of a few startup founders who will introduce themselves shortly, that we can find out what exactly should startup policies cover, and also to find out their views concerning already existing policies such as the ICT policy. So without further ado, I think I'll give the floor to our founders, who are namely Mr. Shimanyi, Mr. Favour, and Abraham Muthia. So they'll each go around saying a bit about themselves and their companies.
Thank you very much, Monica, for making me part of this webinar. I hope you can all hear me perfectly well.
We can.
Okay, my name is Shimanyi Valentino, as Monica has mentioned. I am the Managing Director of Sisitech Limited. We are a software design and development company based here in Nairobi. We have been in operation for about 6 years. So this basically originated from a simple idea from campus students who later on decided to form a company. I am happy to discuss further as we go through the webinar on some of the issues that Monica has highlighted. Thanks. Thanks,
Shimanyi. Maybe we could go now to Abraham.
My name is Abraham Muthia. I'm the CEO and founder of Uzapoint. So at Uzapoint, I'd like to say we transform dukas and kiosks to operate like supermarkets by offering them a simple and affordable technology. So by this, our aim is to simply automate small-scale businesses. I'm glad to be here to join you.
Thanks, Abraham. Favour?
Hey, my name is Favour, and I am the Business Development Director at Soofa. I'm passionate about entrepreneurship and impact, and I'm happy to be here. It's interesting to see Shimanyi. He may not remember this, but he trained us in 2018 because he was also working with the UN in design thinking. So it's an honor.
He actually remembers. And it was fun to find you in the panel as well. All right, I think I'll just get into it. As I've just preempted, there's a recently published ICT policy. And what's interesting about it is that it says that in order for a particular corporate or individual company to be able to supply IT services in Kenya, that its majority stakeholding has to be seen to be Kenyan. So my question to Shimanyi is, do you feel that this particular provision will now be seen to hinder foreign investment in Kenya?
Thank you for that question, Monica. First, I'll just start by saying the direct answer or the short answer to that is true, it will. Definitely people will invest in places where their interests are taken care of, the way I look at it. And I answer this question very carefully in two parts. So one is where we are looking at technology and trying to put a geographical constriction towards it. This is something that isn't there. It's a little bit unfortunate that looking at it from the policy perspective and forcing, I see the pain of the government in trying to make sure that we are consuming whatever is built for Kenya. But also I look at it also on the other hand, meaning that we could equally fail to compete at a global level and be satisfied with all the solutions that we have here. So it has two parts to it. And the direct answer for sure is the way I look at it as a foreigner or a foreign investment agency out of it is that good for competition globally? And is that good for service delivery? Does it give us a reason for the Kenyan companies to even do better? So the short answer is for sure. I look at it as hindering foreign investment towards the different ideas that will actually be there in Kenya.
Okay, thank you for just something to add on. As you've said, in a way you're alluding there's a form of racial capital that normally is within the Kenyan space, therefore causing the issue whereby you find that even though a startup was originally made by a Kenyan, that the board is full of white people per se. Is that true? And in your view, what do you feel like, what can policy do then to rectify such a thing, other than this now 30%, which is still affecting, or going to affect the Kenyan government or Kenyan startups?
Okay, interesting question you pose there. So one, the way I look at it, one, it's very true. I'm maybe yet to point out a startup that completely started Kenyan. Of course, I have a number maybe in mind, but towards that level of growth where you actually see that they're operating at an international level, it's a bit, there are few, very few, unless you're talking about startups that have been backed with very instrumental companies within Kenya.
Yeah.
However, the way I also look at it, and most of the times when people ask me that question about investments and foreign investment, it is two ways. So let's say Favour within the panelist here is someone I've worked with before. So if I had enough money to spare and Favour comes to me with an idea, by virtue of me knowing him through the procedures and legal aspects, geographically connected by virtue of all of us being in Kenya and governed by the same policies, then it's very interesting for me to give Favour some change as opposed to someone from a different place who is completely foreign and new to me.
Okay.
So sometimes I normally look at that in two parts, generally around foreign investment. For a long time, I feel like the more white or rather foreign people will come in to invest into companies in Africa, the more we will have the same people at higher levels of control and management.
Okay.
I'm not too sure whether to allude to that from a policy perspective, because at the same time I look at it, do we want to just consume mediocre products that maybe we might not be able to fully develop because of less competition?
Yeah.
And of course, with this, I'll pick maybe simple examples like we're talking about the likes of Uber who came here, the likes of many other small companies that pretty much picked up the same idea, but in one way or another, they died off. So there are a number of issues that maybe I would say from the way I look at it at the moment, I am not 100% sure in terms of how policy will influence that. But however, if they were low barriers towards effecting some of these things, especially for young people who are trying out on innovations, already I would speak specifically with my own experiences, running a company for about 6 years now as a startup, and I'm still like jumping through some legal things, policies, trying to understand, like it's very decentralized information from a policy perspective. Okay. Sometimes things will also be passed, but the whole startup ecosystem or innovator scene are not properly consulted through the different media that has been provided by the government. Okay. So yeah, maybe two parts to it, access to information, reducing the barrier of entry towards the whole ecosystem. The number of challenges affecting startups already, and legal should at least be the least of it, because we're all struggling to make something for Kenya at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you so much for your response. I think I'll now move on to the next question. Or even before I do that, maybe we could hear the Abraham and Favour's view on the earlier asked question, because I think it's a big issue that now startups are going to have to be able to circumvent. Maybe Abraham first, then Favour.
Thank you, Shimanyi, for that. I mean, you started the conversation very well. So I will answer it this way. What the government is trying to do, or even before we get to that, is that anytime someone is trying to introduce a regulation or a policy, we need to understand the reason behind it. And once we understand the reason, then we look at now the consequences of that particular regulation that is being introduced. At the end of the day, what they're trying to do is just to ensure that as we said, most of the startups in Kenya, you look at them, we don't want to mention names, but when you look at them, you'll just find they are whites. And I know there is this cliche that probably for you to grow and to gain funding, you should probably have someone in your co-founding team or in your board of directors being an expatriate. So of course, there's that conversation, and I think it's a going concern. And so the government is trying to come in with regulations. I will suggest, and I will say before I even answer that question, is as a country, one of the problems and the challenges we have even in policy creation is that we come and bring out we bring out these regulations once we have already had a problem existing. So currently, as we say, we're talking about Microsoft, we're talking about Cisco, we're talking about big companies, and you're telling them now you have to have 30% Kenyan-owned stake. So those things are already a hindrance, definitely, to us as a country. But at the end of the day, they're trying also to safeguard and to uphold young startups like us to actually grow their business to the next level. But one of the things we need to appreciate also as startup founders is that we cannot grow without capital. And this capital, most of the time, I also had a conversation when that issue was raised maybe 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago on Twitter. Someone said, yes, for sure, us as Kenyans, we need capital, and outside people see our innovations, and they are able to put their money into tech and many other innovations. But local investors are mostly interested in real estate, for example. So people will probably buy 10 apartments in one road, but if you tell them you have a brilliant tech idea, they'll probably not even put even 1 million Kenya shillings. So for us, that's a going concern. And if we want to accept that capital from outside, then we need to also make it a bit friendly. So for me, it's a comme ci comme ça, where the government is trying to really support us. But I think by bringing out those regulations, and maybe that's where the topic of this discussion is, they should probably engage us so that we see how best this would be a better fit. Because now other external investors might shy away. That concern is there, and we can see it, because definitely they want huge percentages in our company. They probably want the board to be structured in a different way. Of course, they come with their needs. Even the biggest telco in Kenya has its own regulations on who has to be CEO at any given time. 20 years down the line, that's when we are seeing a Kenyan CEO. So these things exist. It's political in terms of board in the boardroom, but you have to accept it as it is. So the regulation works for us as startups. We can see the government is trying also to have about 20 Kenyan multinationals owned startups, 5 or maybe about 5,000 SMEs. But to achieve that, we need outside capital, and we need to make that access to that capital as easy as possible. So I think the government needs to also check on that. Maybe 30% is too high. Something has to be adjusted there, because I think as much as it's best to safeguard us, they still need some room to improve such policies.
Okay, before we go on to Favour, you have raised a really important point. For example, if a Kenyan has money, they won't think to invest in a startup. They'll think to invest in real estate. But a foreigner, you're seeing them already coming to Kenya to invest purely into startups. So my question to you is, how then can we incentivize local investors to actually invest into startups? For Abraham. Yeah.
Well, I think what I'd say, the times are changing. And I can see currently people are trying to now understand where even technology is going. I mean, the biggest company 5 years ago was probably the one that is distributing alcohol. But currently, it's more of a tech company. So when you look at the landscape, you see there's a paradigm shift of how even people are thinking, or even how consumer behaviors are changing. Initially, we were using traditional brick and mortar in the retail space. With COVID, we've seen a spike in e-commerce. So what I will say for sure is investors now have to work with the times. I think it's not even optional. There's nothing we'll do to them, but I think they have seen already. We've seen so many young startup companies in Kenya raising a lot of funds, and other people complaining and everything. So I think we've created already the environment. People are saying we are the Silicon Savannah of Africa. We've already created the environment. So I think it's more about it's more about education to these people, informing them of the brilliant technologies that are coming up. Most recently, even in Kenya, not just in tech, we saw when COVID came up, there were some students who came up with a bed. I didn't see any local investors saying, we'll take it up. The government, yes, pioneered and said they will take it up, but I didn't see any local investors saying, I want to produce 5,000 of these pieces, come on board.
Yeah.
Let's work with the government directly. So I think it's more of people need to start being more out there. We need to have more organizations, accelerator programs, sessions, so that even investors need to be in the know some of the innovations that are happening and to be told of actually how tech and some of these innovations can actually give them a lot of return on investment in a shorter period as opposed to real estate and those things. And I have no bad blood about real estate. I just feel like tech will give you a bigger return on investment in a shorter period.
Okay, thank you for that. Favour, maybe we could hear your opinion about the two questions I've asked Abraham. Then we move on to the next topic. Okay.
Yeah. So, all right. So yeah, starting with the first question about foreign investment, or really the first question about the 30% aspect from the ICT policy. It's a double-edged sword because there's two aspects. Really, the 30% concern comes in at beyond your Series A funding. This is whereby this is for a Kenyan startup entirely, because when you're selling equity, you don't sell more than 40%, 50% in your first Series A round. But then when you look at the aspect of the foreign investors coming in with, just like Abraham's mentioned and Valentino mentioned about how you have foreigners sitting on the board of many Kenyan startups, I think it's premature for the government entirely, to a certain extent, to have put this ICT policy in place now. Because if you take a look at countries like Korea, you take a look at countries like Japan, even China, when you had a lot of locals having startups that were invested in by foreigners, those locals eventually became the investors in the initial stages in the local startup ecosystem. And now you find companies like Uber struggle in Asia because local ride-hailing apps are dominating because of local investors before. So even Uber, with all their liquidity, their backing from the New York Stock Exchange and venture capitalists, can't compete because of local investment. So I think this policy was premature. It should have waited a few years so that you can enable local startups that have foreign investment significantly to be liquid enough to start investing as well in local startups. If you look at a country like China, Huawei, Lenovo, it's not known, but their initial funding actually came from the government. So when the Chinese government passed a similar policy on regulating a certain percentage to be locally owned, the local startup ecosystem was already quite liquid enough to self-sustain. Then jumping now to the second question, I think it's a general concern because someone I was talking with a couple of weeks ago, if a girl was to get married or a guy was to get married, their family could raise the equivalent amount a startup needs for their Series A. And this is a fact you all know. Same thing goes for funerals, right? But then if the same young person came and said, hey, I have this brilliant tech idea or this brilliant agricultural idea, people would be like, go apply for these government things, go apply for these grants, go to incubation hubs, accelerators. Yet the same people would have given the same amount for a different occasion. So it's actually what we need to have is a shift in our mindsets. And then also because of the uncertainties in the tech space in terms of there have been cases where startups have been invested in, they didn't meet their deliverables, and then as well as a lot of misconceptions and lack of awareness, then that's why the perception of startups is really perpetuated that, you don't invest in a startup unless they've been operational. You don't invest X amount of shillings unless they have, so-and-so on the board. So that really needs to shift so that it's a culture that even crowdfunding is encouraged, that, a startup can go list online and raise, 1,000 shillings from 1,000 people, raise their first Series A, but because of the, the regulation for a private company, you can't have more than, you can't publicly raise funds. So there needs to be also policies to allow startups to adjust to the policy needs to adjust to accommodate startups. Yeah.
Maybe just something to add on, because you've said something really funny from the face of it, but it's very true. So in your view, what role should policy play in incentivizing local investors? Because then again, you've mentioned crowdfunding as a solution to people now, or to local investors now investing in startups or helping startups raise their capital through crowdfunding. But you can't really go and dictate how people's money is going to be used. Like policy can't be seen to do that. So then how can policy then come in to actually remedy that, in your view?
Yeah, so there are a couple aspects to it from the institutional perspective. In countries like, say, take Huawei, a percentage of their investors are actually American, despite the trade clash that they're having in the US. And that's because pension funds in the US still invest in tech companies, regardless of their background. You still have savings institutions, what would be the equivalent of microfinance institutions being small banks within states. So in Kenya, there needs to be tax incentives for large institutions to invest in startups. So then they say that the capital gains tax will be waived, the income tax will be waived on the startup from the returns on their investments, for the first 2-3 years, so that they can see, okay, fine, investing in startups from the misconception that they are risky, but that if I do lose my money, the opportunity cost is actually lower if you consider the tax aspect. Then another aspect for Kenyans being retail investors, individual investors, the aspect of tax deductions. So the same way in many countries, when you donate to certain NGOs, you get tax deductions on income tax. There should be that provision for startups that if you invest a certain amount, there's probably some policy classification for startups, then that will allow for retail investors to explore investing in startups and really build that ecosystem. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your response. I think we can now move on to the next question. This question I'll direct it to Abraham. And the question is, there's been a certain uproar concerning the new digital tax that was introduced in the newly assented to Finance Act. So firstly, there's a bit of ambiguity concerning what the term digital marketplace or who that particular term should refer to. So given you're in the e-commerce space yourself, do you feel that you'll be affected by that particular tax? Or who should it apply to?
So I'll answer first on the ambiguity of that term, digital marketplace. So for us, we understand a marketplace as a section or a place, a platform that enables direct interaction between buyers and sellers of goods, but through electronic means. So I think that's what it entails. Earlier, as I was trying to just research on this topic, I understood even in the Communications Authority page that also part of the logistics is actually under that framework. And it was very interesting for me to understand that, because you find that, especially when you're looking at e-commerce, you're looking at it from a point where you're ordering for goods, they are paid for, and goods are delivered. So it's a complete cycle. Yeah. And for this particular thing, I think we've seen a spike of e-commerce, not just during the COVID times, but in the last couple of years. I was reading a report that says about, is it 39% of private enterprises are actually also transacting online. If you look at the small businesses right now, they're transacting on Facebook, Instagram, and all other e-commerce platforms. So when you look at this, the government is trying to just take advantage of the online sales, because clearly it has been out there that this is the easiest and the cheapest way of transacting businesses online. But at the end of the day, if someone was still paying their taxes, now you're trying to tell them that the argument there is that you're also adding another tax on top of whatever they've been paying. I mean, since 2013, I think, is it 2013 or 2015, that there was introduced that you need to pay VAT on some of the tax that is there. Then now they're saying we also are going to introduce some form of tax for any transaction running digitally. Of course, the government is trying at the end of the day to safeguard and to make sure everything that is working online is actually being traced. But at the end of the day, if you're a local outside investor and you're looking at this, then you will shy away from doing businesses because it means that you're being taxed twice. Or with the same income, there's an additional tax burden to you. So of course, people are shying away from transacting online. Definitely, as you're trying to boost innovation in our country, then we do not need to put a lot of regulations that will hinder these innovations. Because at the end of the day, e-commerce is the best way to go. If you look at China, one of the top billionaires or the top richest person in China is basically because of Alibaba. In the States, the same thing. So if we are trying to regulate the e-commerce, then it needs to be done under a safe framework that benefits both the consumer, benefits the merchant, and benefits everyone. Of course, at the end of the day, by government introducing tax, not just in e-commerce, but in any other business, their aim is that they will get something from the income that we are making, but at the end of the day, they will use that money as well to put in those safe regulations that will help us. The big question will be, yes, the government now is introducing new tax. How then are they helping us in cybersecurity? How then are they helping us with policies that, of e-commerce platforms, which you do not mention names? What you see and what you get is different. So how is a consumer protected by such policies and regulations? So it's not just an aspect also of how much are we giving to the government, but even if they're taking as much as, and they want to introduce as much tax as possible, how much are we getting in return from them? That's how we'll look at it. But also we should not hinder innovation. Our space as a country is growing rapidly. I think in Kenya, we are almost maybe the third or the second country that is taking up e-commerce in Africa. So we need to boost that innovation. With mobile money, it has opened up opportunities, a lot of opportunities. So we need to allow that space of innovation. And lastly, just to speak on the same thing, we saw in 2015 when an aspect like Bitcoin came into Kenya, the government was very fast to say that we've banned Bitcoin in Kenya without really thinking around a framework where such cryptocurrencies will be allowed. As I mentioned, currently even you're seeing other companies who are introducing points to be used as a form of currency in supermarkets and in other stores, but yet we are limiting innovation. So for us, we need to be in a safe space where innovation grows, but as innovation comes in, then the government introduces policies that safeguard both parties, the consumer, the people who are innovating, the startups, and also the general public. So for me, that will be the biggest concern on this particular policy. Let's avoid double taxation. Let's create a safe environment for us to take our business online. I think traditional brick and mortar is not taking us anywhere. So we need to allow growth in this particular space.
We'll move on to the next question. I'll address this to Valentino. And your question is, how has intellectual property protection in Kenya helped aid the growth of your business?
An interesting question. Maybe just to add a few points on what Abraham was talking about, then I'll answer that question. So maybe the first thing is, as a government, we need to understand that technology will come with its own, and whether we use them to our benefit or not, it is largely also something that as a government we need to think through critically. When you look at some of the ideas that maybe might be cropping up within the country, there are some that might be new. I know the way government works is we will benchmark with a certain country that understands what they are doing. But here, maybe you have Abraham who is doing something that is a bit different. They can't travel somewhere to benchmark. Then suddenly, one of the fastest reactions that they have is we need to collect more money. So the biggest question about revenue collection and value for that, it's something that I think I can talk for a whole day blaming the government for. And I will not go into that. However, going to the question that you raised about intellectual property. So one, I would like to say that it counts first of all as a concern. Sometimes whenever you're starting out as a startup, one of the first things, if you get a mentor, they'll tell you protect your IP, then it's a very, very gray area as well when you go there. The process, at least one of the things that I would like to commend the government for is that most of these things are now digitized. So it is not bad in that sense, that actually you can quickly apply for IP, get these certification and documentations. From where I look at it, however, I've not tested the validity of the certification because we all governed based on different frameworks internally. One of the things that maybe I'll talk about for Sisitech itself is one of the products that we have been working on for a while now around music monitoring. And some of the challenges, of course, that have already been mentioned around regulations and policy creations that will actually hinder such innovations. You get to see like something as simple as trying to move from the brick and mortar approaches of maybe tracking music, ideally in Kenya, something as simple as that. But you'll get so many impediments in the process, largely because of a question that I think was posed at the very start, being that Kenya investors don't understand technology. Maybe that's the way I look at it. Or the fact that it is a service or an enabler of some kind. It doesn't really outrightly generate for you a feasible, not really a feasible, but a tangible form of asset that you can say, I'll go to a bank, put this idea that I have as a security for money that I need. Some of those interesting things. And that's why, of course, we'll see most of the investment going towards pieces of land and that kind of thing. The fact that we know we actually have such kind of IP protection in place gives us, maybe we sleep a little well than knowing that maybe someone can actually steal your idea. At the same time, one of the most critical things around the startup industry really isn't much about the IP as such, but the most important thing for me, I've always looked at simple approaches that people have come around with by simply tweaking some form of delivery of a service that completely revolutionized. And I would say largely that's how I think around IP itself. One, commending the government for trying to make the process a little more transparent and accessible to people. But beyond that, I know the likes of Kipi, the likes of Kekobo, who are trying so much to actually not really incentivize, but tell people about all this value. But when it comes to that point, then maybe I knock Kekobo's door and tell them that I feel like my idea is being replicated by so and so. I don't know to what level of guarantee the organization itself could actually secure my interest as the first person who registered there. Yeah.
Okay. My question to you, Shimanyi, is how do you feel that policy can come to strengthen one's claim after it's been protected?
So I think maybe the first thing would be I would think about it from an informational perspective, just a point of getting to know what happens. Most of the times, I think one of the biggest things the startups that we really appreciate is ease of accessibility to information. So I know maybe most of the panelists would agree with me that if I'm working as in a startup and all matters legal, all matters maybe even marketing, most of the times the people that I've interacted with, they are people who are creatively working around the ideas to actually create value for people. So one, if that information can be relayed in an easier way, I know we are working so much around the websites, maybe even creating portals to just quickly check some of these things. I know at the moment, if I simply want to see whether an idea that I'm trying to play around with is patented or not, I think I would have to implement it and then maybe someone will summon me in court. Like, I don't know whether I can find somewhere to just check out, this can be done, this can be done. Someone is working on this and I can actually reach out to them and tell them, can we collaborate in 1 or 2, 3 things? So from a policy perspective, I look at it like that. Also broadly policy-wise, I also feel like it could be good if some of these policies that are being put cutting across would seek the consent of I would say some of actually these people who are in the space. Of course, there's a very huge conversation around who is that innovator. Is it that person who is diligently working on an idea, or the person who comes later, wears a suit, takes it to the government, comes with money and says, we did this together and I need 60% of it. So from a policy perspective, at early stage, maybe could we have some protection as maybe the owners of those ideas, not in a way that caps investment of some kind. Of course, largely again, from a policy perspective, you can't put another policy that will stifle the growth of an organization based on like knowledge and acquisition from some of the partnerships that you can get at the end of the day. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for that. Favour, do you have anything to add before I ask you that we move on to the next question?
What he said is really true, because he's also a developer, look at Kekobo and Kipi's websites from a UI UX perspective, and then you figure out that even before you apply for a patent or a copyright,
Favour,
you don't even...
just short. Kindly, for the audience who are not tech savvy, just explain UI and UX.
Oh yeah, no worries. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, from a user interface and a user experience perspective, EP websites and Kekobo website are not user friendly. Before you figure out where you need to go to find a provisional patent versus a full patent, you've spent quite some time on the website, or you've opened all the links until you found one that sort of made sense. So just from those aspects that are very subtle, that seemingly are subtle, but they're a game changer, especially for startups, whereby, like Shimanyi said, access to information is a game changer. So that if you want to apply for a patent, it should be almost as easy as it is, say, on eCitizen to register for a business, so that it's intuitive, it's well explained, there's documentation to walk you through it, so that now when it comes to a significant solution you're creating, that's when you need, the heavy lifting. But for a basic idea, it should be very easy. Then as well, you look at, for instance, with accounting, there's valuation attached to intellectual property. But in the investment space as well in the country, for instance, if you have 10 patents in your startup, say in Shimanyi startup, that should warrant him to be able to get investment from a bank. But banks don't consider intellectual property as an asset, so which is also another problem in the ecosystem as well. So yeah.
Thanks for that. Do you have anything to add, Abraham?
Maybe what I can say on the Kipi and Kekobo side being very not user friendly, I support that. But just a tip on the iceberg will be that some of these processes also take a lot of time. Like for me, I'm in the process of doing some of the trademarks. Our lawyer was telling us trademarks can take up to 1 year. For copyrights, they say it can take even 2 weeks or up to a month, depending on how fast you're ready to push. And you know how that conversation is from a Kenyan perspective. So, so you see some of those things are also limiting. Of course, the politics that you hear on the ground is that also, as you push for an idea, someone else will be pushing for it. Arguably, and I like to use examples because examples make it as practical as possible. Even political parties, you've seen they're going to register names and you find, then you're told it's already registered. So these things exist even for us as the startups. So how then do we also operate in a space where if I'm pushing for an idea and I've gone to either patent it or to do something about it, if it's a copyright I'm going to get, industrial paper I'm going to present, then let that be safeguarded within the laws of Kenya, because you find that there's a lot of politics that happens behind that gate, some things that you cannot even control. And as a startups, given that most of the time we don't even have as much cash flow unless you've raised fund also, then it needs to be a bit easy for us. And I'd say this cuts across. It's not even for startups, it's even for bigger agencies. I've seen it practically. I was given an example of one of the companies that has raised a lot of funds in Kenya. They went to go and copyright. They're making a product, and with the time someone else just went, saw their product, because they're not copyrighted it and actually trademarked it. Someone else went ahead and did that before them, and they were arrested, they had to pay a lot of money and so many things politically. So you can imagine us as young startups, then we need to be in a space that we are safeguarded. They think those bodies exist, but even then they're not innovating, one. Number two, they're not creating a very conducive environment through which we can penetrate and give our submissions. If trademarks cost maybe about 150,000 plus, how then will a young startup at an early stage be able to protect their intellectual property? As Shimanyi mentioned, that of course mentors, one of the first conversations they start the conversation with is, have you registered your IP? But do you have that cash? Will you put it into protecting an idea that someone can easily replicate? So, I mean, we're existing in a space that needs to be really safeguarded so that it creates a conducive environment for us even to be able to put these submissions forward and actually benefit from the bodies that have been set out to really register these things. Like, for example, very few startups know that there's Kipi, there's WIPO, there's a repo, all those things. So you just registered your things here in Kenya, but you don't understand you need to register it in Africa, you need to register it globally. So some of those things, people also need to be well educated. So we need a lot of education on startups. We need to be ready to accept to be in most of these sessions so that we also learn and understand, even from advocates and lawyers like you. I think the information has to be really passed out, but you also need to create an environment that this is easy to access. It's not just a story that we hear. And when you're raising funds, that's when you're trying to trash some of these things.
Thanks for that. And I think the next question, which ties into what you've just highlighted in terms of registering a copyright or even patenting, can be very costly. So really, will you put that money in your business development or will you protect your IP? You see, it makes you have to now choose between either or. Well, really, you need one to move to the next stage. So for you, Abraham, I would ask, can you describe your fundraising process for your company, or all along have you been liquid? And if so, please tell us your secrets.
Well, you can do a few tenders and then now you start a startup. Anyway, maybe that will be a secret in Kenya, the Kenyan context. But anyway, as a founder, I think so that I don't take you back to so many years back, because everyone wants to start back. But I would say I started my entrepreneurship journey when I was in university. Of course, at that time, you don't have any cash flow. So you start by offering general IT services. But one of the things that we didn't realize, so after graduating, I and my co-founder had an idea. So when we got to it, of course, we were using money from other projects that we had actually gotten. But the one thing we didn't understand from a startup perspective, the first form of funding you need to have is something we call bootstrapping. And bootstrapping is simply that no one will give you cash. You just need to figure out a way through which you will survive. So it's not even a physical cash. It's like someone will give you just bootstrap. Bootstrap simply means, what skills do you have? What resources are available to you at your disposal? So many young people, and I've seen this problem before I say my journey, is you want to be in a space where someone will come, give you your first $10,000, you do a budget for it and get started. For us, that wasn't the case. So for me, what I realized, I was not good in tech. So, but I was learning BBIT in Strathmore. So I just went to the top student in my class, told him, you know tech, I know business, let's team up. I didn't have the money to get a developer. So that's the first form of point. I was able to start off and we were able to put our skills and resources together and jump on to getting a product. But for me, I think my fundraising journey has been from word go. I went to Lions Den in 2016. It was not a rosy affair. Honestly, I first watched my video last year. That's when I got the courage to watch it. But it's because also as startup founders, we don't really expose ourselves into spaces where we understand how that process has to be, the fundraising journey. So you don't know what valuation is all about. You don't know who your competitors are. You're very adamant about your position. You don't know your stuff. You've not gained traction. So one of the things was, someone even told me, Abraham, you're at 0.1 and you're telling us to come in at 0.1. Nobody wants to help you when you're basically scratching the surface. Most people want to come in when they can see something. And with this, I always tell people that at the foundation stage, that's the most critical stage, but no one helps you there. Once you have built a building, that's when people start coming and looking at it and say, hey, we want to come in and help you. But for me, my journey was, I first tried Lions Den, it didn't work. I didn't get any deal, but I got someone who gave me a job. That contract, I'm still servicing it till today, which is a good contract. Other than that, I've gotten a couple of grants. So I've gotten a grant in 2018. Of course, again, as we mentioned in the conversation, it was from someone who's a Nigerian but resides in the United States. So for him, he had me pitch in one of the accelerator programs, had my pitch and just told me, Abraham, I'll give you 10,000 USD and all that. Later on, I exposed myself into a competition by Total. I got a grant. And after that, that exposed me to a couple of angel investors currently in the country. So when we talk about people not investing in their own, for me, currently I'm working with an angel investor who's Kenyan based. But that's just part of my journey. But one of the things to other people and what they can borrow from my journey, for me, it will be number one, do a lot of bootstrapping. Many people will tell you so many ambiguous things. Number two, gain traction, prove your concept, understand whether your product is a good market fit. Because at the end of the day, when you're going to an investor, you don't want your valuation to be so low. So you need to have some traction, you need to have some revenue. I've seen even companies, because I've been in a couple of accelerator programs, and we've had people coming to talk to us. One of the most renowned companies, which has gotten as much funding as possible, is not yet profitable. The CFO was telling us that even in the next 10 years, they don't see themselves being profitable. Why? Because they raised money extremely early. And it's just been a rat race of talking about SDGs so that you get outside capital and how your business is supporting and using the word ecosystem. So for me, I like talking about practical things. So gain traction, prove your concept, even if it's one customer. Then there's a ripple effect around how people talk about your product. Number two, even for us, we're trying to do pre-seed funding. But even before we do that, there's a point where we want to get our company before we are starting to engage these investors. That's not what people are doing. And as young startups, people just want someone to come, drop you a check, and then start on board. For me, bootstrap, get traction, prove your concept, get a good market fit, expose yourself to accelerator programs, search sessions, learn, understand your valuation, put your books in order, all that, so that by the time you get to a point where you need to raise funds, then everything is set. This is one thing that other people who are not Kenyan-based expatriates have learned very well, and that's why they're raising funding. Do a lot of research as well. Have your numbers in check. That's what I can say about funding.
Thank you so much, Abraham, for that. Favour, anything to add?
No, what you said is true. With all startups, I think if you can't bootstrap, you can't survive. You know, there's a story guys don't know. Toyota was selling grains and sugar to raise funds to build Toyota. Aliko Dangote was doing FMCGs in order to go into large-scale manufacturing. So being cognizant that I think the best thing is to live with the assumption that for the first period, you know, a few months, year or two, don't live with the assumption that you'll get angel investors. If you can bootstrap to at least gain revenues, like you're saying, because if you're pre-revenue, you don't have a groundbreaking, you know, life-changing, transformational idea. Like you're not the first Amazon, so your valuation will be very low. Then you have an aspect you haven't actually hit the market. Forget even the revenue. So you just keep knocking yourself down a notch. So if you can get into the market, generate some revenues, build an ecosystem, you'll be good to go. Say, take my case. We got into the KCB Lions Den in 2018. By God's grace, we got an investment. But up until the time we got an investment, I had never taken out a salary from the startup. So anything that I made was from side hustles and projects on the side, because we had that knowledge that if we do start depending on this startup at this very early stage, and it wasn't even a tech startup, it was manufacturing focused, then we would have been, chasing at our heels in the sense that the startup would be registered. So it's registered and recognized by law, but that's all it is, because we'd have eaten up everything that it was making. So I think that's the best. I mean, you could talk of Elon Musk, you know, they were doing side hustles and working from the room in order to keep build up. I think it was it was Zip2 before it became PayPal. So being able to do whatever you can to keep your startup afloat before before funding is the game changer. So yeah, bootstrapping all the way. for sure.
Thanks for that, Favour. I'll maybe just ask Shimanyi to close up that question.
Most of which all the rest of the panelists have also talked about. One of the best things I think I have grown to like is this simple quote that as a business owner, fall in love with the problem, don't fall in love with your solution, because down the line things will keep changing. As long as you feel so focused on how you're delivering this solution and you say you're very adamant to change, you'll be very frustrated in this journey. The other thing, of course, that both Favour and Abraham have alluded to is enjoy a steady growth. Just enjoy it. Because I believe one of the most exciting things about running a business lean and running a business by bootstrapping is a simple fact that you don't have a target on your back. As soon as you take in money, for sure, just know that we are expecting something, however little it ceases to be that. And one of the most interesting things about starting a startup is being driven by the fact that there's this idea that you're really passionate about and you're working fully towards it. Any form of a weight that you carry on the way that distracts you from that kind of purpose, then it makes you tired in the idea that you're working on. Somewhere in the laws or regulations that have been put in place is that you can not fail to, but you are allowed not to submit some kind of tax for the first 3 years of running the business. The funniest and the most interesting thing about this statement is you always go to register that in KRA. Then as soon as you're actually in it, then they're like, oh, you shouldn't have done that. Oh, now you just have to start, Then in my mind, I'm like, why are you being so sneaky about these things if you actually want to support the startup industry in the country? So that's it for me. And yeah, I'm happy to hear if there are any questions.
Okay, maybe just as the final question for Favour, are there any financial regulations that have hindered your startup's growth within your particular industry as we close up?
Yeah, so for Soofa Pay, we're in the fintech space, and that requires several licenses from the Central Bank of Kenya, as well as some compliance aspects as well, all of which are precautions for security and safety standards for the businesses that we support and our clients as well. But the barriers of entry are set really high in terms of the legal work needed, as well as there isn't enough open information that's out there in a manner that's easily interpretable, I guess, so that if you go through the documentation as a startup without any support, any advice, you will probably do things wrong. You'll probably, if you've raised funds, you'll burn through cash very fast. If you've partnered with any company or anything like that, you lose whatever leverage you have. So for us, it's been challenging because of trying to work around all the different legal aspects, understanding it, implementing it effectively, making sure that our documentation is up to standard. Because if you look at the number of fintech companies in the industry, very few of them actually began without large-scale funding, which means a good number of them had, a massive law firm doing their legal submissions and their legal work. So the startups, which is a beautiful thing, of course, is that the founders get to focus on the business, but the legal team get to focus on the legal aspects. But then when you're a startup and you're bootstrapping, you have to do everything. So you have to read the Payments Service Providers Act. You get to learn these small things. It helps in your business, but it's not an easy journey. I think that's the easiest way to put it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for your response. I think now we'll move on into the Q&A section. I'm seeing one of the audience, Norman Munge, has sent a question. So I'll just read it out, then I think Valentino can answer it. So the question is, where does one, as a startup, draw the line between doing external projects and focusing on your startup? Because you don't want to be in a situation whereby you find yourself stuck in doing the external work instead of growing yourself or your business. Valentino.
Thanks for the question. I would say it is a very tricky balance. And maybe Abraham and Favour will also chip in to help us understand that. So I would say the most important thing, one, would be to remain very focused about what this specific idea is, and also to be very aware that for that idea to keep going, a number of things have to be checked out, you know. Like it could be very unfortunate if I meet Favour in a panel, very passionate about his idea, but he's been kicked out of his house. So everyone will question like, oh, Abraham, like, can I even trust him with my money, you know? And I think maybe some of the things that I would say we are slowly trying to work on within the company as well is to pace yourself, diligently write down or have an idea or a plan of how long it will take you to take external projects to work on, to raise a specific amount of money that will actually be that customer base. And as soon as you achieve that, if you're still very passionate about that specific idea, because that's the interesting thing about business, you could be doing a side hustle and then it presents to you as a sustainable business. So if you are a businessman, do you drop it and continue with your passionate idea, or do you look at it as a secondary source of income? So I would say assessing that situation largely also depends on circumstances. That amount of money largely also depends, that initial capital that you'll be looking for through bootstrapping largely depends on how much effort, how much money your actual idea requires. So I would say there's a thin balance between that, and most importantly, be it a team where you'll work together to be aware of these things, because again, you'd find yourself working in startups where you raise a lot of money through the side hustle, only to feel like the side hustle has become the main hustle, and everyone feels like you're no longer focusing on what brought you guys together. So the way I look at it is, as a startup, never fail to sustain a line of stream that gives you money. I would say service it. Find different ways that you can actually keep that stream going, because one of the most important things for a startup is to try as much as possible not to have financial implications and expectations from third parties, which will actually maybe veer off the whole purpose that you have as a startup. So that will be like one part of answering it. The other part of answering it also would be some things like Favour alluded to initially when he started his business. Find a number of people who can come together. I know most startups start early. So maybe if you're starting from campus, find people that you can work with together. There could be through different possible approaches that you could discuss. Not necessarily by paying, you know, like you can find someone who's really good in finance, if that is a very crucial person in your business. And just try to make sure you keep yourself alive, not profitable at all, just to make sure that every other day you live to fight another fight as a business owner.
Maybe, thanks for that, Valentino. Maybe we could hear from Abraham, then Favour.
Well, I think the big question there is, how do you bootstrap? I think even for me, initially understanding how to get started. You want to get to a point where it's the house and that and so forth, and so you can't do anything really, and you can't even focus on that idea. So for me, I think one of the strategies I did was I got two developers, and then one developer was specifically handling projects, then the other developer was specifically handling our product development, and we did this for 2 years straight. So anytime I go and look for business that we can do, there's one guy who's programming that, and then this other guy, because you have enough resources, then this other guy is actually working on our idea. So for me, that's how I bootstrapped. But you have to think outside the box. The whole idea is my circumstance might not be your circumstance. Our situations are different. For me, to start off, we started at a pet sitter. It was a very small place. We started as lean as possible, sitting on plastic chairs, all that. So you have to think about it. Don't think about it from a Silicon Valley perspective. Think about it as practical as possible. What do we need? We need a desk, we need a chair, we need this, we need this, we need Wi-Fi. How much is it? We just need to survive. Probably all of us needs just maybe 25,000 or 20,000. So how much do we need as a company to operate? what projects can we do? If it's 2 websites a month, we need to do 2 websites a month so that we all sustain ourselves. And in 1 year, then we've achieved our target. I think also Valentino mentioned something about having a target, because it's very easy to veer off and start working on something else. So for me, I'd say you have to have that bigger picture in the mind. Currently, and in the last, I think, 2 years, I've not been doing projects for customers. That had to stop, because at the end of the day, then I knew that dealing with this product is what I wanted to do. But at the end of the day, of course, once you start getting those investments, even the investors will tell you, you have to remain focused. But at bootstrapping level, you have to do anything and everything, of course, within your ethics, to make sure that you're actually surviving